like a lot of these things are tools within the process and that play different roles. So when we're talking about generative audio or generative video, like, I don't know, that's not really the voice of God in your documentary. That's an actor. That was fake too. That somebody was hired to play the role of a narrator. It's good for an industry that employs voiceovers and narrators that's a human, but it doesn't make it any less or more real in some sense of what is it. It's a tool in the storytelling.
AI is being used for scripting, for shooting and producing movies.
AI is being used for everything.
Hollywood production is being transformed by artificial intelligence.
Not only has AI transformed the way that we create films, it's also transforming the way that we tell real-life stories through documentary and unscripted storytelling. These aren't one-off experiments. Rather, AI is used to create and assist on some of the biggest documentaries that are currently in production. So, how should we think about AI for documentaries, and how do we create documentaries that are simultaneously captivating and also ethical? Well, our guest today is here to answer some of those questions. Fred Grinstein is a media executive, producer, and filmmaker based in Playa Vista, California. Fred has an incredible resume when it comes to nonfiction production, working with major distribution studios like HBO, A&E, and Vice. Fred is deeply passionate about emergent technology like AI, XR, and Web3, and is hoping to build bridges between traditional content and the modern creator economy. Not only does Fred have an awesome resume, but we have been working with Fred to create an AI documentary course, which will begin its first beta session on September 4th. We are incredibly excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for hopping on, Fred.
I'm super excited to be here. And if we get to talk about the way bagels brought us here, we'll learn about that later. But no, honestly, I will say I'm a humble alumni of yours. And I'm proud to say that you helped fine-tune my own adventures and the tools. But in a lot of ways, the unscripted TV era was born from smaller cameras, easier to own and operate editing systems, and eventually more and more tools that I was part of a wave of people that were turning this into an instant business because we had this cable TV landscape to work with. So it's this incredible test kitchen of creativity. To me, the catnip for my process, and it really ran for a long time, was sometimes these new tools or new worlds or new ideas or new things we hadn't yet done with cameras or with our storytelling. And that's really what we ran with for so long. And eventually I got on the network side and got to utilize the skills. Eventually things kind of kept evolving for me and where my career was going. And I was very proud to land in Los Angeles working at Anonymous Content, which is, one of the premier production and management companies in Hollywood. And, again, it was always this opportunity to look at these things almost like ingredients in a recipe, and how do we do something new and novel. But in terms of where do I find my passion again, I was thrilled to find these new intersections with technology that were sort of very naturally. And it's something that made me very happy to be in Los Angeles. I came up in New York most of my career, but LA has been such a natural intersection for so long of technology and storytelling. So it was so great to see that even in spite of how much is changing, this is also a home where things are starting again. It's that feeling of seeing new ideas we hadn't played with before, experimenting with them. And I think this stuff has seemingly more naturally been finding homes in advertising, music videos. Everybody loves to compare themselves to the Disney studios or the Marvels. And I think that's instinctively where, when we type in the word imagine as a command to an app, I think that's where things tend to go. What interests me is, how do these tools come back to telling us stories about the world we're in, and almost help us. In some cases, it's also just helping us do our jobs better. It's helping independent filmmakers have more resources. But I mostly get excited about the creativity.
And I have a question before we dive deeper into that. I want from you to explain to us, what is the difference between all these words? We have documentary, unscripted, and nonfiction content. What is the difference between the three of those?
I mean, I've always felt when I was working A&E or even in the different companies I was at, we used to even deal with like a bigger problem that is all just under this blanket term reality. And I think documentaries almost more recently become something that people get more excited about. I mean, it's been around forever. It's the baseline, but we were in this bizarre business that the word we used to describe one thing included everything from shows about cops to American Idol and a lot in between. And so I think we've always had a little bit of trouble with words and semantics. But I think if we're trying to start leaning into it, I'm sure there's people that will call me out on more official definitions. But to me, there's documentary more broadly tends to lean a bit more journalistic, tends to lean a bit more into something that holds itself up to slightly more ethical set of standards of how you, the storyteller, are interacting with the story you're telling and the kind of the social contract you have with your viewer. I think things start to go on a bit of a spectrum as we open things up to unscripted content, where those things are sometimes even formats, things that are meant to be repeated. They have a bit more of a constructed nature as we keep going down that line, whether it's things that are full on kind of constructed reality shows where we're doing unusual things with people that are entering these mousetraps. But I think that's kind of one spectrum. But I think to me, documentary is kind of the core in terms of where frankly, I think most people's real passion even is when they sort of emulate the journalists on Vice or or BuzzFeed or a lot of the digital publishers that gained a lot of momentum at the end of the last decade. I think that is still something that almost is an offshoot of what was used to be more uniquely news and journalism. But I think as we get into unscripted entertainment, that's where I think, and this is something that I want to talk about in our course, and this really leans into some of the choices we make on the ethics stuff, is there stuff that feels more inherently objective, where you and your social contract of what you're saying, like this really is the story of Harriet Tubman. Like this is really what happened to her. This isn't my interpretation of it. And there's still debatable, point to be made that as a storyteller, you're framing things, you're editing things, you're doing that. But it's still like what you're communicating to the world, there's something objective about what you're presenting. I think at some point when you're someone that sees that moment as something that carries a lot of responsibility, that in some ways you are adding to the broader relationship people have with facts and truth and information. I think that's when we do get to sort of enter these questions about the existing tools, frankly, and the way sometimes even without AI, things can be manipulated and construed to just be a bit of a fairy tale that includes footage that looks real. I think with AI, we're in an even bigger place where we want to think about those choices. And that's one of the big topics that I know there's some really great leadership on this. And I think it's the kind of stuff that I think you want to at least present to new creators and even to old creators that are nervous about this stuff, that there actually are an emerging set of best practices to interact with these tools, that then once you have that in mind, you're mostly running with the creative, amazing energy they have. But I don't know if that's a very long answer to your very simple question.
No, it's so helpful. I feel like I really just appreciate you have such a way of speaking to things that add layers of context. And I feel like I'm just having like all of these pockets of curiosities happening as you're even talking. And so it's just helpful to hear. And I love the idea of like, it's up to your own kind of social construct and your contract with yourself as a filmmaker. All of these are just really interesting points.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's one of those topics that in some universe, it'd be wonderful if somebody really did have an enforceable set of rules of this is how it's supposed to work. But we're a world of free speech and a lot of, open content opportunities. But I think even within just documentaries, just think about the spectrum of, some of these granddaddy, players. You have someone like Werner Herzog, who's like, I don't know, hero to a lot of us in terms of how creative his films are. I mean, there's literally a film that I love that's the perfect example. It's called Little Dieter Needs to Fly. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's a very famous scene that he will narrate this to you. This isn't anything clever he even talks about this at public speaking events. And actually, he went off to make a scripted version of this movie as well. The film's about this German man who grew up living in Europe, and he sort of experienced World War II bombing in his in the city, and somehow that led him to, when he moved to America, he really wanted to fly planes for the military. For some reason, that was his reaction to living in a town that got bombed out during the war. He then got his Navy pilot license. He became a pilot in Vietnam, and he became a POW on his first flight. And then basically the rest of the film is mostly a POW story of him telling his story of how he survived being a prisoner of war. As he's telling this story, like from the get in the film, Werner Herzog's in his house, and you see him, he's talking to the camera. He opens the door and he invites the camera in. And on the wall, there's these 3 pictures of doors that are just artwork that for some reason he has. And he continues to self-narrate the experience. And he explains like, well, I have those pictures of doors because I spent so much time in captivity that, it means a lot to me to sort of look at doors. They sort of give me a sense of freedom. I'm paraphrasing, and I'm probably missing a couple of the finer points. The main point is that Werner Herzog I don't know if he celebrates it, but he isn't bashful that none of that is true. That is a conversation that he, as the filmmaker, had with his subject, and he observed the pictures of the doors. And he said, that's really interesting. And he kind of had this really deep conversation with, like, I wonder why you love those pictures of doors. And at some point between the two of them, they agreed that that's valid for a documentary about his experience as a prisoner of war. So I think Werner Herzog probably runs as fast and loose in that example as most people might feel comfortable saying of what is a documentary in terms of being objective and factual. But here's one of the heroes of the space kind of telling you that I make films, I don't make news. So that's sort of one of those sort of uncomfortable debates here, is that at some point there's people that think of themselves as filmmakers. I do think there's a lot of people that take it a lot more seriously. I think a lot of people really have a much more reverential take on their role as a documentarian. I don't think they would do what Werner Herzog would do. But I think that spectrum is kind of what we're dealing with when it's a creative art form, not just like a practice. And again, to me, the fact that Werner Herzog openly tells that story takes us back to the ethical practices. He's telling you he does this. It's not hiding it from you. I mean, he's doing it in the news. It's not in the film, and that might be somebody's debate about how transparent he was. But I think that's the point. At some point, that's his social contract as an artist. He's like, I'm the type of filmmaker that takes a lot of license with my stories. And that's something that his fans know about him.
Yeah, that's such a good example. And I think it really segues us into what is kind of the first larger conversation that I'd like to have, which is the intersection of AI with documentary, and how, documentaries, it's in the name, inherently are documenting something in real life, and then telling a story with, the help of things that are not necessarily always firsthand documents. Like we have recreations that have, helped to illustrate and entertain people as they watch documentaries and graphics and things like that. So I'm curious, just from your perspective, artificial intelligence is an amalgamation of so many different things. Some people are calling it synthetic content. And so I guess just from your perspective, is AI even capable of creating content for a documentary? Is it inherently not a documentary if it uses AI? And how are you interpreting this new generative technology in the context of these real life true stories?
I mean, I think the current state of this and its application to unscripted content is, and I think as we'll see in the course, like a lot of these things are tools within the process and that play different roles. So when we're talking about generative audio or generative video, I don't know, that's not really the voice of God in your documentary. That's an actor. That was fake too. That somebody was hired to play the role of a narrator. It's good for an industry that employs voiceovers and narrators that's a human, but it doesn't make it any less or more real in some sense of what is it. It's a tool in the storytelling toolkit. I've worked in enough unscripted content that, there's entire Hollywood film sets that fill themselves to do a recreation of the Civil War, or, some scene around JFK's assassination, or, that those are actors. Those aren't real people either. What is twofold happening is that it's disruptive in principle to the business of making content, because people like Tyler Perry suddenly revise their plans when they think about how does this stuff fit in a future ecosystem. But creatively, in general, in the practice of having an ethical set of approaches to how do you include imagery, so it goes back to this idea of the social contract of like, what is your use of this tool? But have we been using all of the amazing tools that Hollywood has had, all along to make things that, sit inside of a broader category of unscripted content? Of course. I think there's a mix of emotions. I think people are also upset about these effects on the industry and the unknown that implies. And then separately, there's, I think, another dynamic that people are also, there's an age of misinformation that lives outside of all the work we're doing that I think also informs people's emotional reactions. But I think if we create sort of transparent approaches to how we use these things and maybe common sense approaches, this isn't that unusual. I think, how do we sort of challenge our own creative as we approach the making of any content, and in particular, perhaps content that reads more of an explainer model, let's say, or something that is more telling historical stories. I think we have a creative tool that it might make us more creative along the way to choosing the documentary you want to make. So those are different stages. The thing that frankly excites me the most is the stuff that's not on the user's manual. And it's when creative people do what they've always done, is they start tinkering with these things and think about, wait, what else can I do with this? One thing that I'm particularly, very intrigued with as a subgenre is the biography format and the idea of an autobiography, in a way that, there's some version of something being able to physically write their story. And that's the way that they've been able to communicate to the world, I wrote this. But when you no longer need a filmmaker to express something for you, when you can maybe create your own impressions of that thing that happened to you, like, that's something new. Like, that's actually AI starting to enter a new utility in telling a story. Or if I'm trying to communicate to you a dream that I had last night, instead of hoping some filmmaker can do it for me, what if I did it? And what if you watched me in the process of creating that? And part of the documentary is watching me react to my own interaction with this tool that's letting me express myself. Like, now we're starting to push into something. I don't know if those are the biggest ideas in the world, but those are the things I imagine, that's more than a tool, that's actually creating a new type of moment that we can capture and tell stories about. And I think that's where the infinity arc starts, is that we haven't fully gotten to play with those moments.
My recent dream I would be able to capture is I was at a dinner party and all of a sudden Caleb was gone. And I was like, where the heck did he go? And turns out he was invited to Martin Short's house to have wine, and he didn't invite me. And I was so sad. And I woke up and I said, if you get invited to Martin Short's house for wine, you better invite me. That's what I would have to show with.
I would, me and Jiminy Glick, I would pay lots of money just to have a whole night with him.
Yes. Well, it's funny you talking about, using AI to interpret your own stories in a different way. There's actually a dream interpretation AI. And I don't know if everyone listening to this podcast has checked it out. It's kind of like ChatGPT, but hyper specific. You just type in your dream and it will give you an interpretation of what it believes your dream was about. And funny enough, it is very accurate to stuff that like maybe you're dealing with in your life. And, you're just typing in, I had a lizard tail and like was on the moon. And it's like, maybe there's something going on in your life, that's a little stressful. And that's why you feel like your head is like in space, like, just like silly stuff like that. But it's really, really funny. And I love the idea of bringing visuals to that as well. Like, that sounds like a really cool app if you could just like speak into a dream and then watch it.
I think the fact that it not only are you able to kind of create your own art, but some of these tools are doing it instantaneously.
Yeah.
So again, like almost like the person that did a dream sequence documentary, they still had to wait a few months to see rushes and sort of maybe give the director notes and say, sorry, that was way off. That sort of instant reaction that a Kriya tool can give you.
No.
I don't know. There's just things here that start to, again, when I put my unscripted brain, it's like, how are we scratching at new experiences or new things that we haven't been able to somehow document? And again, that's what, the early days of unscripted really did. Like, nobody really knew, and I know this is a controversial subject, nobody really knew what it was like to be a cop. And out of that, just simply doing a follow doc, dozens of TV shows came out of that actually now we're able to create experiences. And again, that's its own topic of whether it was net a good thing. Some people don't like it, but I think the idea of capturing it and finding a way to bring that to people, I think that's where I really get excited about. And obviously, I keep coming back to my unscripted community, but it's going to be the social video world too, that clearly is already running at full speed at how do these tools become new ways to interact with storytelling.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm curious, there's so many directions I want to go, and this might be a part of a larger multi-part conversation. But from your perspective, because I think that there are so many ethical conversations to have, and we're going to have quite a few of them inside of the course. But how are you framing the responsibility towards transparency? So to put some context, Netflix recently, there was the news about that documentary, What Jennifer Did. And they used some AI tools, I think really to upres. I think that they're basically using Magnific to make an image asset that was really, really small, just large enough to be like 4K basically. And when they did that, there was like six fingers and like just like weird stuff happening, and no one in the edit caught it. Like it was people, like just everyday people watching the documentary, they'd pause it and be like, wait a minute, like that looks, something's off here. And so that opened up a larger conversation because there really hadn't been any precedent set for, hey, whenever you're working on a documentary, make sure that the image upreser that you're using is not a generative upreser, but just, something more like Topaz photo AI or Gigapixel that just like scales up without interpreting new information. So I'm curious, like from your perspective, what are some of the initial ethical considerations and guidelines that you've been kind of hearing pop up? And then what are some of the unresolved conversations that, we still are trying to figure out as an industry?
I mean, one of the sort of parts of the course that I'm so excited to shine a light on is some things that I've been doing a little bit of writing on too, is I've been talking to the APA, which is the Archival Producers Alliance, which is a really kind of wonderful example of people just jumping in and kind of filling the holes where the user's manuals aren't. They come from the point of view of the archive component of documentaries, and we'll get into a lot of greater detail there, but they've been really leading a lot of the dialogue on this. And I've drawn a lot of inspiration from the way that they sit at this incredibly sacred place in the process, which is they're not making documentaries about, UFOs and some kinds of mythical creatures. It's people like Ken Burns that are, doing the very hard work of tracking down sometimes archives that have never been seen and doing the post-production work of even bringing that stuff to being even watchable, because sometimes there's restoration efforts. And ultimately they're forget their business, like their craft, their art form is the way that is, it's like a museum experience in terms of its value. Like you're literally looking at a piece of history that somebody had the wherewithal to point a camera at. To hear the way they process this stuff, which has been awesome for me because they're also excited about the innovation. They're also excited about how these things could help independent filmmakers and be a part of, solutions to problems that every industry has and sometimes technology solves. But things that they bring up that are meaningful to me is, that this idea of changing people's relationship with the historical record. Look, it is wild to be able to just type into one of these windows, whether it's Midjourney or Runway, sometimes even use words like documentary footage of the gold rush. There's like a famous clip that they share a lot in their presentations that Sora kind of happily kind of presented as part of like, look what we're capable of. I think it's a drone shot, and I think it's pretty quick to know that there was no drones during the gold rush, and arguably that's what recreations do as well. We bring kind of Hollywood value to historical content, but it had grain to it. It was trying to sort of have a sepia to it. Like, look, there's choices that you make when you're doing a recreation, but when it's so good, when the technology is able to do it so well, we're entering this uncharted space that it's the sort of knee-jerk people have towards the broader concept of deepfake, that you're creating a whole public perception around the way things look. And I relate to this because I think in a lot of ways unscripted reality. We're in the early days of playing with these things. I'd say we were mostly having fun with them, but we would, you would use fonts that look like a journalistic font. You would use the presentation of an interview looks like an important looking presentation of somebody talking to the camera. They look like they're on the news. So at some point, these are semiotics that you're messing with of people's relationship with the information in front of them. And I think they present a bit of a sequence that we'll get into in the course that like, look, it's like, if you can find the archival footage, you should use it. It's better. Like it's your viewers will be happy to see real World War II footage. If you're going to start rendering it and creating it, then now you're entering this space. Like, and I relate to it as like this idea of your social contract. Like, what relationship are you building with your viewer? What should they believe or not believe? And I think some people just want to be creative and they think it's awesome and everything under the sun is great. But I think it's a delicate thing that you have a choice in that moment to sort of say, maybe I'm going to go for something that's more hyper stylized. Something that I heard the other day that I think almost goes into the transparency part of this was that people talk a lot about biases, the responsible AI stuff, that I think for good reason also encourages people to recognize that the technology is still sometimes limited in its ability to represent and, get races and genders and representation broadly. But they made a point that like, they're like, yes, that's also, but the big bias, was the human inferiority bias, that we just assume the computer's better than us. And that there's this sort of step that we just kind of go with it because it's awesome. And we just kind of let go of frankly, quality control. We let go of fine tooth combs. We let go of the type of, attention to detail that we might give in other scenarios for some reason. And I think that's kind of a broader answer to me, is that especially in documentaries, especially in the social contract moment, at a phase where you actually did triple check your facts, where you did make sure there aren't six fingers, that you did look for ways that maybe the computer was just doing its thing and it didn't know better. And I don't know, maybe the technology gets so good that we no longer have six fingers, although I'll miss it because I think it's kind of hilarious when there's a six finger. But I think the main point is we need to sort of remind ourselves that we're the final step before. And at some point, what was your intention that you started off with in the beginning?
I'm just loving this. I'm thinking with everything you say, I'm just thinking about even like our JFK documentary we put together and how our goal in putting that project together was just like to show the facts. Like we could have our own version of the story or whatever we believe as individuals, but we're like, no, we're going to do the research. We're going to put this together with the facts of what happened. And it's very interesting to go onto the comments of that video and just see every conspiracy under the sun exist, and how everyone has their own interpretation of the facts. And so I'm now just thinking, about like whatever, we put a lot of work into that project, and a lot of research, but also like there still could have been bias because of it just being me and where I grew up. And that's just interesting to think about in every project you work on, having that extra layer of proofing something before you push publish.
But I think it was pitch perfect what you guys did, because you guys gave us behind the scenes. You gave us the BTS. And I think like that implies its own, by the way, maybe we got it wrong. It's okay. But you're not like it's at some point, it's a bit of entertainment. At some point you're creating this thing to let me revisit a story that I thought I knew. I mean, at some point, this is that fuzzy space that documentaries are in, is that we are sustaining someone's sense of being entertained. But the fact that your choice as makers was in that website that you guys created, like I think that was awesome. I think you actually instinctively knew I'm walking into something that has a lot of, reactions to the fact that this footage didn't exist, that there was no 360 video of this event. And you're not only are you embracing it, you're actually that's almost part of the story. Is that part of this process is this idea of piecing together history. There's how do you do it within the production? How do you make sure everybody downstream kind of knows when something was synthetic, and that's part of like the Bible of the product that you're delivering? And then there's how do you relate to your viewer? And I think that's when this starts to become more elevated as a process.
And I guess having that, those guidelines or the way of communicating is going to probably help be that bridge. I'm curious for you as Fred, like how do you envision being a bridge for kind of the traditional, content community and like this modern tech content creator community?
I mean, I think there's a lot of people hurting with the nature of the business. And I think I remember the first time I saw a friend of mine introduced to me their editing tool that I think we're going to at some point talk about, a tool called Quickture. I mean, it's a really cool piece of technology. I hope they do very well as a company. But my immediate reaction, having been someone that's been trying to like make a few movies in the last few years that just will not finish, they're taking forever. At some point, you run out of money to keep post going. The idea that you've come up with anything that can make more out of less as an automation tool, because it's using AI to sort of help work through sort of some of the busier body parts of your process, like that's a gift to independent filmmakers. So to me, that's almost the front line of people that should be running towards this technology, because they've already had to be scrappy. And as long as they can wrap their heads around the legalities, these ethical things that we need to have best practices, a lot of these things are going to rapidly improve people's ability to create, but without getting lost in some of the really time consuming, resource consuming steps. So to me, that just that general like awareness building, that I think the independent filmmaker should be excited that there's maybe not all the tools are for them. Maybe they're a verite filmmaker that has no interest in creating sci-fi worlds, but maybe they want to, be better prepared for their scripting or process because they've been, working with, chatbot tools, or maybe these editing tools that accelerate the editing process. So I think it's not that there's something for everybody, but there should be something that satisfies your curiosity as a creative person. So that bridge, I think, is the most important one to build, because there's a lot of people hurting. There's a lot of people that want to complete the work they're doing. They want to have access to making stuff. I genuinely am more drawn as to the idea of like, what are these things that aren't in the user's manual, as I keep saying? Like, what are these opportunities that on the other side of this revolution are going to be the new normal? So I think having the ethical frameworks to look at these things while going crazy is the fun stuff. And I think that's actually the kind of community that seems to be drawn to this, is like there's people that are very, very experimental. And I think it's so much fun to be at these events and the ones that you guys throw to.
And I'm curious from your perspective, if we kind of zoom out a bit and look beyond just mediums and formats that we're already so familiar with, what are some of the, even if they're not inherently AI, if they might just be a little more experimental and innovative from a technology standpoint, what are some of the projects that you've seen pop up that are approaching storytelling in an interesting way that you think is new and really like a great example of, just thinking outside of the box as it relates to documentary or filmmaking?
I think that's what's so fun about this moment, is like we're starting to see people do things first, and then you can start extrapolating. So I think my first experience with, I think, really the broader toolkit was a film that I saw at Sundance a few years ago called Welcome to Chechnya, directed by David France, who did the amazing film How to Survive a Plague. And this was an equally incredible topic, the story of basically an underground railroad of sorts across Russia, where there's a collective, I think, based out of Moscow, where they have a network all over the region that shuttles at-risk LGBT people to safety. Frankly, it couldn't be a more vital topic to that community. But the reason I bring it up is they, right out of the gate, frame one, they present it in a disclaimer. So they were already taking the right cues from that point. As they introduced this idea that they use deep fake technology in the film to disguise the faces of the people that were being shuttled, which is simultaneously also fascinating filmmaking and just like the creativity of even the experience of it. And I can't remember if they did this fully intentionally, but it's like a little bit off, or maybe the technology wasn't perfect yet, but it was actually good that it was a little bit off, because you never fully immersed. You always kind of knew that's not really them. That's not really them. This is a story that without that technology, you can't tell these people's stories. You're putting them in danger by pointing a camera at them. And obviously they still pointed cameras at them, but in terms of then putting those images all over the world. So to me, that's so awesome, because it's an incredibly riveting experience watching it and sort of knowing that sort of peekaboo feeling that like, that's not who I think it is. But then knowing that this is how else would I experience the rawness of this story. And that was a verite film. That wasn't recreations and all these other tools. So to me, that's clearly people way ahead of the curve already imagining how do we sort of make stories possible with technology.
Sorry, no, I was just curious. Can you define verite film? You've said that a few times. I'm just curious for anyone out there who's...
Yeah, I think it's one of the subgenres here that's probably most safe from AI for a while, because the reason you watch a sports documentary that's following the real-time, women's soccer team is because that's actually them. Like there's no real debate of what you're pointing cameras at. So, the types of documentaries that are pure raw footage. So those are types of films that I think are probably mostly still that preserved, beautiful thing, much like those archival films that are just purely like, here's like archive content. But I do think, like, how do we apply these other tools to them? How do transcription tools help us go through those hundreds of hours of footage and be able to spend more time editing story instead of just editing sort of assemblies? That's the type of solution that my friend Irad has with this product, Quickture. So again, I think there's something here when we start opening our minds to how do these things apply to the stories we're telling. But I think to answer your question, you said, what are some other films? I mean, the other film that I just saw this weekend that isn't technically AI, but at first I thought it was, but that's my own fault for not reading the full news article. But it's Generative, the Brian Eno film that directed by Gary Hustwit, who did these awesome films not so long ago about Helvetica. If you love font, you will love his film. He also did this other film called Objectified that really got into design. But he had been chasing Brian Eno for many years to make a film. Among many people, everybody wanted to make a documentary about Brian Eno. And he only said no until they came back with this proposition that they built this coded generative art, I think. I might have to 11 laps what I just said to get it right. But I think that's right. I can pull it up. But it's basically an algorithm for assembling the film that takes the 500 hours of archival footage that they found in Brian Eno's personal collection, the 50 hours of interviews that they did with Brian Eno over the course of a few years, and presumably spent some time assembling a story. But then there's this sort of series of forks in that assembly, in the code, that every single time it screens, it generates a new cut of the film. Dramatically so. I think one of the people at the screening had seen a screener cut, and he was like missing, there's this scene in the version I saw last night that wasn't in the version we saw tonight. And then vice versa. There was like new moments in the film that he saw that night that weren't in the previous night. The point being is that they came up with this new, very disruptive idea that what if the director doesn't really completely direct this? What if they're almost creating a relationship with content, that it sort of re-expresses itself? What if the editors are sort of also taking their hands off the keyboards in a way that it's sort of allowing that sort of, live consciousness of the algorithm to start driving it in a way? And ultimately, what if the audience relates to this differently? And the way he related to it is like when you go see a band perform, it's never the same performance every night. That's part of the joy of going on tour with a band. They're trying to create that experience for movies. Now, it's debatable if this is right for every documentary, and I think some people genuinely like a beginning, middle, and end to the story. I think Brian Eno's story is particularly well suited to this more sort of stream of consciousness approach. But that to me is an opportunity born from technology. It's a moment born from somebody looking at one way to tell a story and saying, why does it have to be that way? And that whether we always come up with the biggest answer to that, I think that's like the healthiest thing for all these mediums, to sort of have people approach things that way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good transition to now talking about your course, because in week 4, we're going to get into some of the more experimental and innovative ways in which you can utilize AI beyond the traditional mediums that we're used to. But let's maybe we can start with a bit of the story. Like, how did this course come to be, and how are you thinking about the takeaways that you hope people get from this course?
How did it come out to be? I was just hanging out with you guys, and I think you're rad, and I love what you've been doing for the community. And I think I knew, as we discussed, that you guys also had a real love for unscripted content. And as we sort of keep thinking about these bleeding edges of the world, to sort of kind of lead the conversation. It's funny, even in preparation for all this, whether it's imposter syndrome or just humility, at some point I was like, great, I'm just going to go find all these people that obviously know all this stuff. And as much as I think I have a decent handle on where the state of things are, and there really aren't a lot. I mean, there's definitely people experimenting, but the notion that there's people that are like fully down the road as like established AI doc filmmakers, that's emergent, I think.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to find out that I'm wrong about that. And I think that's kind of where I come from on this, is that we're in a place of inquiry. And I see this course as a chance to acknowledge that history of innovation within this art form, and how the people taking this class are their own writers of the user's manual of what is the stuff capable of, as we also walk through that with a sense of how to do that ethically and practically. But that ultimately, having those values shared, as we ate some bagels on the east side of LA, and it seemed to come up very organically that this was an opportunity, and I was very humbled that you guys felt that way too. And I'm just thrilled to think that this is something that we all get to sort of introduce as a dialogue and a conversation to a new set of creators.
Yeah. And I love that it's something, we have a bit of a background with working. I don't know if people know, but like Caleb has a double major. He's also has a history degree. And so he's very passionate about specifically like Reconstruction era. So he has made a few documentaries and is working on one. But this is something we're very passionate about. And it was just genuinely like hanging out with Fred, eating a bagel, that we all learned of this together. And it's just really sweet how organic and natural this has come together. So we're super excited.
Yeah. And I think that one of the reasons why it felt so interesting to work with you, Fred, is, it's very clear, and hopefully for folks who are listening to this podcast, it's become evident as well, that you have a lot of reverence for the ethical side of AI filmmaking and for truth and how we approach this new era with integrity. And I think that's obviously very important for us at Curious Refuge. And I think it is awesome to know that the person who's creating the world's first AI documentary course is also someone who is deeply exploring and working with people and organizations to find what those ethical standards are, so that we can train other people in how to go about telling stories in a way that is helpful and not taking away from truth, but rather contributing to it. And so it's really exciting.
And Fred, I'd love, what do you hope people learn by the end of taking your course?
I mean, I think there's so many different kinds of people that are tuning into this. I'm excited for people from my world that have been in this space for a long time, perhaps that are already tinkering with this stuff. I'm excited for them, if they haven't already kind of jumped in, to see this as a way that, like, how does this make sense to me? Me being someone that's in this space already. And I think it's possible that those people are mostly applying it back to the companies they work at or the films they're already making. And there's plenty of that mindset. I think, speaking personally, I think there's a stress point in the legacy kind of content world. I think, some people feel like things are kind of moving backwards from this like premium era when everything was hyper creative and people were really chasing a lot of diverse stories. I think there's a bit of a mainstream effect. And I think there's a risk averse culture happening on the buyer side that I think some of us who are in that kid in the candy store of like the more creative innovation stuff, I think it's been hard to feel that way when, the only thing that seems to work is the same thing that worked last time when you're trying to sell a TV show or a film. I mean, that's a bit of an insider kind of conversation amongst us, but I say that this stuff is fun. The creative tools are pretty cool. I think you can be in that sandbox where maybe you're even doing something that is a little unethical if you were to go out and make a big movie and blast it all over the world when you took the Beatles album and started, animating the Abbey Road scene, without anybody's consent or permission or pretending like that footage existed. But it's still kind of cool that somebody could do that. And it's fun to start playing. And how would you use that tool for something that you could do without concerns? That's just fun. And people need to let themselves have fun in this business. Then I think there's a lot of people that I hope have always been fans of the space and the genre that maybe, didn't go to journalism school or didn't come up in the ranks of this business and perhaps perceive this stuff as feeling like the usual Hollywood thing. It's something that people over there do. it's something that feels inaccessible. Frankly, I hope that's shaken off after 20 years of unscripted. Is that in some ways it's been kind of ingrained that almost anybody can pick up a camera and start a YouTube channel, or anybody can pick up the camera and sort of pitch an unscripted show. It seems that way, but I think new people, I think hopefully this democratizes that even further. That you even can tell those sometimes hard to tell stories. How would you sort of tell stories about complex ideas? Ultimately, I think it's the same mission I sense you guys are on. Is I think this is a very emotional thing that's happening to the world. I always try to appeal to that first when I talk to anybody, as if I have it all figured out. I think I always try to remind people I have children. I'm plenty paranoid about a lot of the things that people put out there about whether it's misinformation or the worries that accompany a lot of this stuff. But I genuinely feel like I'm better equipped to navigate those things because I spend time in this. And so this isn't Kool-Aid dripping. This is, yes, it's fun. I do think it's productive for people that are thinking about what the workplace of the future is going to look like. I think people should feel hyper creative and have fun with it. But at some point, this is a way to engage. And I think there's a way to use a course like this. I think I frankly benefited from it when I took your course. Like, I think there is the freebie, just run around the internet and figure stuff out. But I think having some structure, having a community, having a place to sort of check in with others and go through those moments together, getting feedback from sort of a peer group. I think that's awesome for people that are at different stages, like I described.
Yeah. Well, I am super excited. And I know that already just from our wait list, there's hundreds of people that have raised their hand and said that they're interested in taking your course as well. So it's going to be an awesome experience. And I am just super grateful to have you just guide us along this new world and this new creative endeavor. Now, before we close things out here at Curious Refuge, we like to do some rapid fire questions with our guests. So we're going to ask you, Shelby's going to run point and ask you a few questions. The goal of this is to be like stream of consciousness. So just like whatever comes to mind.
One sentence, quick.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll limit my rambles.
We've not done this in the last few episodes, but I really enjoy it. So we're going to do it with you today, and I'm excited. All right, first question. What is your favorite documentary?
I love Act of Killing by Joshua Oppenheimer.
Okay. We'll have to check that out. What is your favorite unscripted show?
There's so many.
Stream of consciousness. What popped up first? I'm just very curious.
I mean, I love, it sounds like I'm shilling, but I worked on Cash Cab and I'm very proud of that. But
okay, but we have the Cash Cab game.
I know.
Yeah, we did like a Cash Cab game. Thank you for inspiring a board game.
Okay.
For House.
We do.
You know what? I loved Catfish. I think Catfish is a really awesome TV show.
I love that. What was the most challenging project you've ever worked on?
I mean, there's different types of challenging, and I think a lot of people that know me will probably think of different types of challenging. I would say there's a series I'm very proud of that was very hard to get from soup to nuts delivered for a lot of different reasons. I know this is the long answer, but it's a show called Dogs of War that was about soldiers with PTSD overcoming their stuff with dogs, service dogs.
Okay. Wow. And that was the most challenging because why?
There was a lot of people telling me it shouldn't be a TV show.
Okay.
And that there's a lot of reasons why nobody will ever watch it. There's a lot of reasons why people didn't want to pay attention to PTSD. And we believed in it and we pushed through it. And I think I always thought dogs were the way forward. And we got a 4-part series.
Agree.
I'm very proud of that one.
Dogs are the best. Okay, I have 2 more questions. So this one is there an AI tool that you appreciate that is underrepresented in the online world?
I think the magnific relight trick is like one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And I just want to use it in everything. It's so specific. But I just love that you could just like swipe a light and it just changes the entire room. That's so
Yeah.
cool.
So good. I love that. We need to do that in our like living room. Figure out where. We have like no furniture still. We're just still kind of getting settled. But what is the weirdest thing you found at the beach?
The weirdest thing I found at the beach. You're okay.
I love this. No, and for everyone who is listening, before this call, we had about a 30-minute conversation with Fred about him being a snorkeler and going to the beach and finding really obscure things. And so he showed us something. You can show us
for setting
that.
it up. Otherwise, why is this sitting on my table? It's because I shared it with you before. But this is pretty cool. This is a shark egg.
Wow.
That I found on the beach. Actually, I got this yesterday. But it's
Yesterday.
a horned shark egg. Yeah.
Wow. A horned shark. You know which shark because of the egg?
Because it's a weird looking egg. And I think if you Google it, it'll tell you it's kind of a weird looking shark with horn.
That's so cool. Is there like a resale market for shark eggs? Like, how much is that egg worth?
I mean, I'm worth a lot of money because of my shark eggs.
Yeah.
So I don't want to give away too much. I have my buyers.
That's super cool though. I've never seen a shark egg. And
they're mostly 3-year-old toddlers that are just like swimming in money and they love it.
Amazing.
They love it.
That makes sense.
Well, Fred, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast and for just sharing your insights. For those of you listening to this podcast, you can learn more about Fred's course by visiting the link below this video or going to curiousrefuge.com. The beta session of Fred's course will start up on September 4th. We are all very excited to get that started and meet you all inside of the workshop. So, Fred, thank you so much for hopping on.
Thank you both. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Fred. We so appreciate you.
See ya.